Hi there, Doc from Barcast Audio here today to talk with you about contracts as tested on the MBE. Our bar exam basic series continues with this module on performance and breach. Let's talk some key tips that can help you score better on the MBE, some key rules to remember, and some key tricks to keep in mind as you're practicing questions and preparing for the bar exam. So just big picture, when it comes to performance and breach subtopic of contracts on the bar exam, you can expect about 6 to 7 questions on this area. So obviously one of the larger, more important areas on the bar exam. If you can score well on these, you're well on your way to scoring well on the exam as a whole. Good baseline, good sort of general rules to remember as we're going through this. So when I'm talking about performance and breach, what am I really talking about? I'll tell you, this area contains a lot of subtopics that can be a little bit convoluted. We're not going to go through all of those right now. We're going to focus primarily on some of the big topics. So just to give you sort of a primer on what's actually included in this section, performance and breach tests things like excuse for non-performance, conditions, material breaches, impracticability, warranties, impossibility, and discharge of duty, among some other stuff as well. But those are sort of the big picture things that are being tested in this sub area. So in looking at a performance and breach question on the MBE, what should you do first? If you don't know the answer to this, go back, watch our first video. You should always know the answer for a contracts question. You should always be looking and assessing, is this a UCC contract, sale of goods, or is it a common law contract? And the reason I emphasize that in the prior video, and I emphasize it in every contracts video, every contracts audio lecture we do, is that is going to allow you to quickly eliminate certain wrong answers. Any answer that is not speaking to the exact type of contract that is at issue in this hypo, that is no good. If they're giving you answers that would apply only to UCC contracts, then you'll know if you're looking at a common law contract that that's no good. And now you have 2 less answers you have to worry about, and already we're on our way. And you'll quickly move through these, and it'll help your timing as well. So first off, always assess whether it's UCC or common law. You know that already. Let's talk more specifically about performance and breach. One of the more commonly tested subtopics within this area is the idea of performance obligations. And performance obligations are more commonly tested because they easily allow the examiners to test your knowledge of both the common law and the UCC and the differences between those 2 rules. And that's because performance obligations are going to differ for parties to a UCC sale of goods contract and parties to a regular common law contract. Now, the main rule I want you to remember when thinking about performance obligations on the bar exam, on the MBE, in terms of the common law, is that substantial performance by one party is generally sufficient to trigger the other party's duty to perform their contract. Now, that rule sounds like it makes sense, but that rule applies even where a party breaches their contract. So if a party breaches their contract, but they still have substantially performed, that is probably going to be sufficient to trigger the other party's duty to perform their end of the deal. The non-breaching party can then sue, they can follow up and sue, but you'll typically see this tested where the bar examiners give you a fact pattern where they're essentially asking you to assess whether what happened here was a material breach or a minor breach, and you'll sort of be asked to assess the significance of the breach within the hypo. Remember that if one party only commits a minor breach at common law, the other party still has to perform. Typically, if there's a material breach, you'll know. It's very undeniable that they're sort of very straightforward what a material breach looks like. It's major, big time, speaks to exactly what the contract is seeking to attempt to do, and the bar examiners are not going to get too tricky in terms of the line between minor and major is not going to be gray. It's going to be black and white. You'll know what a minor breach looks like, and you'll know what a major breach looks like. So now that we know that rule, that substantial performance rule, keep in mind that a non-breaching party's duty to perform only is discharged under 2 circumstances. So now that we've talked through that sort of general rule with substantial performance, keep in mind that a non-breaching party's duty to perform is generally discharged only when 2 criteria are met. First off, the breaching party's breach must be considered material. As I said before, that material breach is going to speak to the actual purpose of the contract itself. And 2, that material breach must occur prior to the non-breaching party's performance coming due. So the non-breaching party must not have their performance due yet. They must still have time to repudiate and discharge their duty to perform as a result of the material breach by the breaching party. Let's talk now to UCC sale of goods contracts. Another big picture tip, something that's very commonly tested here, is the perfect tender rule. The perfect tender rule is pretty straightforward. It provides buyers with a right to reject goods if they are not tendered exactly as they were ordered. So if you see a hypo, an MBE question, where you see a sale of goods contract, always quickly just say, oh, is this perfect tender? You'll know pretty much right away whether it's going to apply or not. And generally, you'll see a buyer who is rejecting goods that don't comply with what they ordered, and they have that right under the UCC. But also keep in mind the two major exceptions to this rule, because this is another sub area that the bar examiners love to test. They love to ask questions about this. And the two exceptions to the perfect tender rule are essentially that a seller who fails to make a perfect tender still may have a right to cure that imperfect tender, where one, the time for the contract has not come due yet. So if they make a delivery that's prior to the date that their delivery was actually due, the seller has a right to cure that imperfect tender. So they can try to cure it, and the buyer is not necessarily automatically allowed to reject those goods if performance was not necessarily due yet. They still have time until, let's say, a September 1st date. And number two, that the second major exception I want you to remember, the seller may have a right to cure if they reasonably believe that the buyer might accept the non-conforming goods. So let's say this buyer and seller have a previous relationship where the seller was unable to provide perfect tendered goods in the past that the buyer had ordered, but the buyer had accepted those in the past because they could make a do with these goods. They're not exactly what they ordered, but they needed them and they could make do with them. So if they had that sort of relationship where the seller could reasonably expect that they may accept these non-conforming goods, then the seller is going to have a right to cure that imperfect tender. So again, number one is if performance is not yet due, the date of performance is not yet due. And number two, if the seller could reasonably believe that the buyer would accept the non-conforming goods. Another major note I want you to keep in mind when thinking perfect tender, this is sort of just briefly here, if you read through a fact pattern and you see that this is a case of rejection of imperfect goods, think for a second, assess whether this is an installments contract. Because remember that if the parties have actually engaged in an installments contract, the perfect tender rule does not apply. So these are some big picture tips for this area of the MBE, contracts performance breach. I hope that these short, quick little tips can help you as you're going through your MBE questions. Keep them in mind and you'll see your scores slowly start to improve. Be sure to check us out at barcastaudio.com. Subscribe to this channel for more of these MBE basics videos. Until later, I will talk to you guys soon. Bye now.